for providing the funding for this toolkit and webinar series, and also acknowledge the Interfaith Center of New York, which worked on this project with us, the Reverend Dr. Storm Swain and Reverend Stephen Harding, who are the co-authors, the principal co-authors of the content of the COVID section of the toolkit. The other portion of the toolkit is actually an evergreen resource developed by Thrive NYC. And also to thank Alfonso Wyatt of Greater Allen AME Cathedral, a longtime colleague who will be facilitating the panel discussion today. The Reverend Dr. Storm Swain, who will give us an overview of the grief aspects of the toolkit. And the Reverend Dr. Will Ashley, also a longtime colleague, all of us actually, dating back to 9/11 recovery days. And Will Ashley, at the time, was the director of the Care for the Caregivers program that was funded to support the impact of caregiving on clergy and faith sector providers throughout the 9/11 recovery effort. He and Storm are also authors on a variety of papers and books specific to the impact of trauma and grief on first responders and impacted communities and survivors. So thank you all for joining us, and I will hand this over to Storm to lead you through some self-introductions and then the overview.
So it is my delight to be here. This webinar, as you know, is a 1-hour webinar, and it will look at the toolkit, have the conversation, as Peter said, and then open up for questions and discussion and engagement. It's meant to be a facilitated discussion at this stage, and no fault, low stress, informal environment where each person's context is seen as unique and particular and privileged in terms of your own understanding of mental health and how that impacts in your house of worship and faith community. So we really look forward to the group participation at that stage. The toolkit is really designed to help you serve your community of faith as we look at particular issues around issues of stress, issues of grief, issues of trauma in your community, and today particularly as we look at issues of self-care around possibility of secondary traumatic distress, moral injury, and particularly burnout during this time. And we're hoping it will help you identify and mitigate against some of the stress that is a natural part of any disaster, but particularly in this pandemic, complicated issues to face during this time. So we are going to look through some of the aspects of the toolkit to orient you to it, and particularly to think about pathways of referral that may resource you during this time. So Stephen and I, who have been co-authors of a good part of the toolkit, come to this webinar thinking often back to the primary disaster that shaped us. And here we have a picture of Pier 94 that was one of the family assistance centres during the 9/11 disaster response. Both of us were serving as volunteer chaplains with the American Red Cross at this time, and our job was to provide spiritual and emotional support, disaster spiritual care, and to liaise with mental health professionals who were there providing emotional and mental health support to whomever might need it at the time. one of those days, Stephen happened to be near the door when a woman came in, and she looked a little disheveled, and he asked how he could help her. And she said, "I'm here because of my 8-year-old son." And this is about at least 3 weeks after the disaster, or 3 weeks after that initial day of impact. Of course, the disaster was still going on. And she said, "He came into my bedroom and told me to get out of bed and get help. He said I couldn't just stay in bed and keep the covers over my head. I had to get up and get help." And she said, "So here I am." She had been in bed since the attacks, and she had been too scared to get up and get out. She had not been able to shower, care for herself, was not eating much. And at that moment, the chaplain's role was to be alongside her, and what he did was introduce her to a mental health colleague, walking her over to access the resources she needed. So it's those kind of realities that we are facing in our communities. People who are dealing with the stresses of this particular disaster. And you can see in relation to 9/11, that was a presentation at a Family Assistance Centre. But the reality is, in this disaster, people are presenting to us, in our faith communities over emails, perhaps over Zoom, perhaps over the phone, or they are out there not able to access the resources they need. And we are ringing them, we are intentionally reaching out to them. So the reality in a disaster is that it is different than ordinary time, as it were. And it is helpful to know, both on an individual and a community level, where we are in a relation to what we call the disaster life cycle. And we've given you 2 different examples of this. The emotional life cycle, which you will see in kind of the graph, with high and low points, but also a disaster life cycle that looks at those 4 movements of preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. Because this pandemic is so complex, and in different places around the country, different states are in different stages on that disaster life cycle, and different communities are impacted in different ways. We think it's helpful to think about this both on societal, community, neighbourhood, and at times individual levels. Those particularly impacted by COVID in their household, in their house of worship, in their community may be in a different place than other communities that feel like they're still preparing for the major impact, or those communities that may be, and I think this is highly debatable at this time, looking into recovery. With 9/11, for those of us that are New Yorkers, we know that we're not just talking about a day. We were talking about at least a 9-month period where the recovery was going on at ground zero before we got into looking at short or long-term recovery. The complexity with this disaster is the impact of it is going on over a considerable period of time, and we are not even looking into short or long-term recovery at this stage. So it may be helpful for you to look at this and think about, where is my community on this? Where do I see myself on this? Am I in that heroic response? Are we still in the honeymoon period, as paradoxical as that word may be? Or are we kind of plummeting down into the state of disillusionment? Particularly, I think, as 2 pandemics are layering on each other. The pandemic of racism in our community over the COVID-19 pandemic as we go through. So again, just thinking about what is the difference mental health-wise between between mental health challenges in a community, in your house of worship and congregation, in normal, or perhaps I will say ordinary time, and how is it different in a pandemic? In a pandemic, the reality is it's all of what went before plus all of the pre-existing realities, all of the issues in your community that then get exacerbated by the increased stress, decreased access to care, the layers of grief and loss that are going on, and those particular aspects of being in a disaster that goes on over a long period of time, with the question about where are we in terms of this impact. I often relate it to like living in an earthquake that is not just one particular day or time of shocks, but repeated major aftershocks as we go through, and where we are living with these kind of underground realities of the earth is not stable, things are not safe in this way. So for me, the difference and the analogy in terms of emotional and spiritual care, what we would call pastoral care in my community, is that we have to frontline safety. And it's like looking at the difference between caring for somebody in ordinary circumstances and caring for somebody who is suicidal or homicidal. We have to frontline safety. We have to start from a plan of care with immediate response, more intentional directive response, and then move from there. My guess is that you all have a list of those in your house of faith, in your faith community. There are a list of people that you are concerned about. And in assessing psychological safety, not just physical safety, those who are most vulnerable may be those with pre-existing mental health conditions, such as anxiety, depression, bipolar, or other major mental disorders, as well as those experiencing trauma or stress-related disorders that the pandemic may exacerbate. Also vulnerable, we know, are those on the autism and schizophrenia spectrums, those with personality disorders and special needs. And of course, we know that this is exacerbated by social isolation and quarantining, what it is to be able, not to be able to get out of our homes to seek the resources we need, but also those that are socially, economically, historically marginalised and have been targets of prejudice, and particularly as we see at this time, the focus on those that are constantly living in an unsafe environment, experiencing the racism that is no longer just under the surface in this country, but right on top. We don't know how it is in your own community about seeking access to mental health care. There are often a significant amount of reluctance or barriers to seeking care. I know working with my students, I teach at the United Lutheran Seminary that has campuses in Philadelphia and Gettysburg. Some of my students are pastors in North Philadelphia, in the urban food deserts that are there. And they say, when we're talking about suicidality, you know, in my community, you just don't call the man. It doesn't feel safe to ring 911 to seek access to care that way. And for many in that community, those that are spiritual care providers, leaders of faith communities, they are seen as the frontline mental health resources. So again, we invite you to look at what are the barriers to seeking mental health care in the community. Are they the traditional barriers of thinking, you know, if I reach out, I'll be seen as crazy? Or are they economic, cultural, and spiritual barriers? If I reach out for mental health care, does that mean I'm not trusting in the divine? Does that mean that I'm seeing, I'm somehow less than as a person of faith. So again, we invite you to reflect on this in the context of your own community. When we're looking at those in our community, we need to think about these in the context of both mental health, but in the context of the disaster. Where are they in that disaster life cycle? What are the reasons for them to be stressed beyond what others are experiencing? Are they part of that those vulnerable and different populations? Is there anything in their behaviour that is causing you concern? So rather than the way that they are presenting normally, what happens when somebody in your faith community presents to you and they are like that woman, looking more dishevelled than they are normally? They aren't able to communicate with their family. They're not able to carry on their work if they have it. And there's just something that's either seems to be a little off, or the volume turned way up high in the context of this. So one of the ongoing questions for us is this a normal stress response in a highly stressful situation? Or are there signs of acute stress that we really need to pay attention to? So some of the assessment questions may be helpful to you. We want to start with a presumption of mental health in the context of a pandemic where everybody is stressed. So the question, rather than how are you not coping, is how are you coping with what's going on? You know, we all approach those in our faith communities in different ways. So these are some suggested questions or ways to think about. Nothing in this toolkit is meant to be prescriptive, but more descriptive, some ways to resource you in your reaching out to others. How are you coping? What's not going well? So again, that kind of stress assessment. What are you missing? That's a grief question. What do you need right now? So again, thinking about people's access to resources, support, care. What do you need from me? This is a question in terms of our own role and resources. Sometimes what people need from us is a good referral to somebody else. Sometimes what they need from us is simply to hear the story. And we know that empathic, caring, listening, reflective, supportive relationships really can make a difference. Again, inviting person to have agency over assessment themselves. Have you passed a tipping point in your behaviour that concerns you? So again, this is not a kind of objective, we're the experts, but people are experts over their own experience. And are you doing something that you haven't done before? Now, this may be a resilience question, or it may be a question that leads to looking at what might be a mental health challenge in the midst of this. So when we're thinking about stress, we all have really good reasons to be stressed in the midst of this pandemic. Living in New York City in the last 3 months has been extraordinarily stressful for many. And generally the feelings, as we see on the screen, are different than experiencing clinical depression or another mental health disorder. It's pretty normal to feel anxious or lonely or sad or scared in the context of a pandemic. And again, those supportive relationships, hearing the other story, being alongside them, if it's over the phone, if it's over Zoom, if it's 6 feet apart and having a conversation, whatever ways you are connecting with persons in your house of worship or community of faith. Often that is all that is needed, a caring relationship, that kind of spiritual and emotional holding space. And yet we also should be alert for signs of profound psychological distress, an indication that referral to a mental health provider is needed. So as we think again about the woman at the Family Assistance Centre, her first referrer was her son. He was the one that said, you need to get out of bed and find somebody to help. So if we think about the difference between ordinary stress in the midst of a pandemic and acute stress, it's often not the symptoms, the sadness, the anxiety, the emotional, psychosocial, physical responses to stress as we feel adrenaline and cortisol running through our body. Often the difference is that this continues on for a significant period of time. The symptoms of stress are magnified or experienced most of the day. In the toolkit on page 30, there is a table with the cognitive, emotional, physical, behavioral, and spiritual signs of stress. And again, these are normal in the context of a pandemic. But what happens, like the woman presenting to the Family Assistance Centre then, when these signs of stress begin to affect a person's ability to care for themselves or be in relationship with others, to be able to work or carry through the tasks of their daily life? So as we see signs of traumatic stress, it's helpful to wonder, perhaps in relation to that woman, or think about those in your faith community, those of your house of worship. Are they experiencing ordinary signs of stress? Is the volume turned up on that? Or are they experiencing signs of traumatic stress? And for those of you that have those of you that have healthcare professionals in your community, first responders, those on the front lines of working with those who have COVID-19, those who have the coronavirus. My apologies there. They may well be experiencing signs of traumatic stress. They may well be experiencing that sense of constant hypervigilance, the re-experiencing of the traumatic events. When they go home, they can't stop seeing the person that they were working with during the day, or the body bags, or, we were just getting them out of the ambulance and they died in that place before I was able to do anything. Are they having nightmares that are making it unable to sleep, or waking up out of the nightmare as if they are right still on the front lines there? What happens with the dissociative response when they are losing touch with their surroundings? And again, what happens when they are more vulnerable or irritable or constantly angry? So during the pandemic, you can look through the toolkit and see these signs of traumatic stress, see the risk factors for traumatization, and see some of the other realities that are going on, and assess for your community those that you particularly might need to reach out to, those with particular risks in the context of this. As those in the faith community, we need to also look at the possibilities of secondary trauma, vicarious traumatic stress, compassion fatigue as we care for others. And think about, in terms of self-care, those things that may impact our own care for those in these realities. I want to, we're going to come back to this in the context of another webinar on trauma, grief and trauma, but this is a picture of two people in our community, healthcare providers who have committed suicide in the midst of this pandemic. This incredible loss of life and loss of those that care for others that are...
Hi, it's Peter Goditis.
Hi, Peter, we can hear
I'm
you,
on the
so
Zoom.
I encourage you to mute yourself. So we're going to go past looking at complicated grief,
Sure.
which I think is going to be a particular...
I'm just listening. You're free to talk.
Peter, I'm trying to mute you and it's not quite working. But I want to highlight some particular issues for those of us as caregivers during this time. For those on the front lines, the particular issues may be post-traumatic stress disorder, or within a 30-day period, acute stress disorder, perhaps particular issues around moral injury, where we feel like we have been part of perpetrating harm to others, particularly those that feel like they should have the resources to care and have not been able to do that. For some of us, one of our prime resources in terms of care and grief and loss is to provide a funeral, some sort of recognition or ritual appropriate to our faith community. And what happens when under conditions of quarantine, when we aren't able to do that, when we aren't able to facilitate the grief of others? So some of the particular concerns for faith and community leaders as we go on this time is to note that we are looking at issues of burnout. So what I want to do now is to hand it over to Alfonso and Will, if I can, and to discuss some of the realities around self-care, around stress in this time, around working with grief, around the risks of burnout, and ways to, in your own community, to care for yourself. So Alfonso, I think I am going to hand over to you and invite you to pick up the discussion as we move through this.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. Thank you for taking us through what is a work that many have participated in. As you heard, my name is Alfonso Wyatt, Reverend Dr. Alfonso Wyatt. I am happy to say that I was connected to Peter, Chloe, Dr. Ashley, Susan Herman, all independent of each other. And now I have the pleasure of being with them all. And Peter and I go back to 9/11. I put on a presentation for people of color at 9/11 to recognize our contribution. I just thought that that was a way of moving forward. Chloe is part of, well, the head of the Interfaith Center of New York, which I was founding member, and did many of the workshops around the Rabbi Marshall Meyer retreat series that dealt with a slew of both legal and mental health issues. And Dr. Ashley was my professor at New York Theological Seminary. And I have learned much from him during that time. And even when he doesn't know I'm watching, either on webinars or hearing other people. So let us put this together. We're going to call it this gumbo we're going to make some gumbo here, which brings a whole lot of disparate pieces to the pot, stir it up, and we see what we have. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Ashley if you would introduce yourself, perhaps not as verbosely as I did, and I'm going to begin to ask a few questions.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for all of you that worked really hard to bring this about and to pull this together. And clearly, the city of New York and beyond needs this kind of resource and toolkit. So we thank you for your dedication, for your focus, and making this happen. I know this is not an easy task. As the governor of New Jersey's chief of staff told me last night, we're trying to fly the plane 50,000 feet while we're also trying to construct it at the same time. So I think we're all in that the kind of space where we're trying to fly the plane as we're constructing it 50,000 feet above the air. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. It's always good to see my friends and colleagues of a couple of decades. And so it's good. It's good. I'm always proud of Alfonso White and the work that he's done and what's going on in the city of New York. So I want to thank you for the universality of this project. I'm speaking to you both as a pastor, as a certified licensed psychoanalyst, and as a retiring professor in 2 weeks. And so bringing all of those to the table, that my perspective. But I think most and foremost, I have to speak to you as a Black man in America. And when we talk about self-care, we talk about trauma, and we talk about issues of being able to survive the coronavirus. We're also talking about trying to survive as a Black person in America. I'm pastor of people who are told repeatedly, take off your mask by the police so we can see you. In contrast to what we're being said, people that are being harassed because you have on a mask and we can't figure out who you are. So that's a starting point for me. I'm dealing with family members and friends who are afraid for me to go out. I have earned doctorate. I was a dean. I've written books. Doesn't matter. You're a Black person, and you're out there in this public. So that for me is part of my introduction. That's what I bring to the table. I'm glad I can write books. I'm glad I can write articles and all those good things. I'm glad that the governor knows my name. But when they're not present, I'm a Black man in America. So I just want to put that out there as a starting point.
Well, that's a good place for us all to take this journey. And as one who is well read and published, and I also know that you've been doing for the American Baptist, you've been doing webinars for over a month now. So given your perspective and given what you know, if I could ask you just a jump off question, what message in the Toolkit workshop resonated with you, caught your attention?
I think that the Toolkit is a wonderful vehicle. And as you said very, very early on, it has to be contextualized. So, right, as you say, it's not prescriptive and it is descriptive. And so I think it falls on all of us to say, so out of this toolkit, how can we contextualize it? And clearly that would mean that we're going to place greater emphasis on some aspects of it than others. That we have to do, so as we do every Sunday morning, have to interpret the toolkit for our particular concrete context. So if you look at it strictly as, reading the King James literal version, you're going to go down the wrong path. If you look at it that there's many versions, you have to interpret the text from the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, then you'll be fine. And so, for example, in my community, instead of some of the questions that were asked, we probably would say, hey, so what's kicking your butt today? And they would say, how many hours do you have? And I said, well, give me the Reader's Digest version. We probably would say, if we're not being polite around company, so what did white folks do today that was stupid? How did racism impact you today? And again, they'd say, how much time do you have? And at that, again, that would be taking the same questions, getting at the same information, but asking it through the context and the lens of, we're not being socially correct and politically correct and being nice and polite. How do we really have a conversation about what's going on?
Well, thank you. And you're absolutely right in terms of contextualizing. And as one who was at the start of the Rabbi Marshall Meyer retreats, and knowing that it would bring world faith traditions and leaders of those traditions together, finding ways to keep conversation moving and have a point, as opposed to looking at denominational differences or faith tradition differences. How do you think the Faith Toolkit walks that line in terms of being both specific and general as it relates to the faith community?
Well, firstly, I compliment that the selection of pictures. You know, they say pictures are worth 1,000 words. So I was very pleased and happy when I saw the choice of pictures. I've had major fights with some of our disaster caregivers, and you know the messaging when nobody from the Black diaspora is any of their messages or not seen in a positive light. So you know I was sensitive to that. So I looked at that in the beginning. And again, the different stages, the comparators, laying out the mapping, what are common reactions to trauma and grief, what are expectations, how do you reach out for help, what is it that you're able to do within a global context, and then you find out specifically for your neighborhood. Those are things that I think that the toolkit does very well, and I thank you for pulling that together. And again, as a universal global tool, it's great. As you know, since you brought up the work that we've been doing with the American Baptist churches and others, one of the things that's been our theme is everybody's not going to be okay, and let's be honest about that. And so if we use that as in some communities as a starting point, what do you mean everyone's not going to be okay? Everyone doesn't have access to testing. When we start doing contact tracing, there's going to be challenges. If you can pick what statistics you want to look at, but clearly between, if not 70 to 80% of the people that have died are from the African diaspora. So everyone's not going to be okay. And so it's a wonderful toolkit, but you might find yourselves focusing on other aspects of it more than others. So grief becomes a very big part of our work. Because if somewhere between 60 to 80% of your population is dying, then clearly you're doing grief. And as you know, I've talked to many pastors, imams, rabbis, and the black rabbis who say, you know, we're doing far more funerals than we're accustomed to. We're worn out. You know, we know all the things about not burning out, but how do you not burn out when you're doing, you know, twice or three times more funerals than you're accustomed to? And like you said, you can't do them in your traditional normal way of saying goodbye to someone. So those are very real concrete challenges. One of the paradigms that I have used that summarizes what's been said is that for us that are of interfaith clergy, that our role in this has been both personal, pastoral, and prophetic, and that we've had to put on a prophetic hat in order to make sure that the resources are available to all, that all are being treated fairly, and that COVID-19 is connected to undoing racism for us. You can't separate the two.
So now, just suppose there was someone, of course not in our celebrity panels that we are all looking at, but suppose there was someone that didn't fully understand why a mental health toolkit should be written to faith leaders. How would you respond to that?
Well, we've done enough research, and there's enough out there, articles and infomercials, et cetera, that we know that people go to their faith leaders before they go to the physician, before they go to agencies, unless there's a medical emergency. I mean, we are the front line. Long before anyone in Washington or in the city hall said we are essential, we knew that we are essential. People look to us, they listen to us, they follow us. You know, one of the challenges that we have oftentimes is that we probably see more people on the weekend than most people in other professions. And so we have a constituent base. We have people that follow us, whether on the radio, television, or just at regular local congregation. So it's important that we're armed with the right information, because people listen to what we say. We've had this conversation with folks in the medical field before. that, you know, if rabbi or imam says, or pastors don't take the medication, guess what? They're not going to take the medication, no matter how many degrees, no matter how much you publish, no matter how much the medical association says you're a wonderful person. So it's important that we have the right information so that we are leading people in the right way.
I want to lead you, speaking of leading, I want to lead you back to your comment when you said that there may be different parts of the toolkit that one would, you know, lean more heavily on than others. How would a faith leader, and I'm just assuming that for the sake of the question, without training, how would he or she know what to do in case of a circumstance? How would they know what to do?
One hopefully, if they're denominational based or faith directive, and there's someone within their organization that is an expert or has more expertise, then they lean on that person.
Look at you.
They ask for help. I mean, basically, they ask for help. I mean, I remember Dr. Margaret Kornfeld, Cultivating Wholeness, said that you have to know when you're in over your head as a starting point. And so you have to know when you're in over your head and say, hey, I can't do this with myself, to make use of the resources in the community.
That was the part. And even though we've been separated for a few years, the connectivity is still there. You have to know when you're in over your head, and or you have to know when to make a referral. And as I read the draft of this speech, Dr. Breyer can vouch that it was very important to have resources for people to know where they're going to go. Well, my host has told me that we're going to take a few questions. And the easiest way to do it is if you would put your question, if you have one, put it in the Zoom group chat, and one will be picked. We may not get to everybody's question, as that plane that we built in the air, it's starting, I won't say it's starting to fall, I'll just say that it's starting to land. And we want to make sure that we land on time and we're able to use this webinar for the purpose. And I'm giving you time to ask a question. If you don't ask a question, I will resort to my first career as a high school teacher, and I will call on people.
Let me just say, as his professor, he would ask a question, they want the entire session for the day.
Don't bring me back to my class. You know what I just thought about too. So. Anybody, yes, anybody. If you've written one, I don't see one written as of yet. And if you have one, you can just raise your hand and just take yourself off mute and ask.
I'm curious about what practices Storm or Will would recommend, and perhaps things that they've found successful themselves in practicing self-care. Particularly, I mean, in communities of color, this double whammy of COVID-19, the high mortality rates in communities of color, on top of just the general stressors of the pandemic. And I think for Storm, similarly, as a mentor to many clergy who you've taught as a professor over the years, who I'm sure reach out to you, that sort of same question. I mean, what's the best advice on how we stay sane in the face of crazy, but also under the stress of quarantine and the stressors on ourselves as caregivers in congregational settings? I'll let Storm go first, and then Will.
Thanks, Peter. You know, at the beginning of this pandemic, I'm an academic, and so many people were writing all this stuff about, you know, how to cope with the pandemic. And I found that you know, I didn't, like, words didn't seem to be helpful to me at the time. And particularly as I have a friend who's been really, really sick with COVID-19, and just the ongoing sense of grief and fear for her in the midst of it. I found I was feeling it in my body all the time. So what's been helpful for me is to come back to embodied practices that help me cope with stress in the midst of this, and practices that give us a sense. I think there's three things for me: agency, blessing, and community. And this friend is at some distance, but we looked at kind of breathing together, particularly in the first part of the illness. Issues around lungs and breath has been really hard. As it goes on, vascular issues come more to the fore, and other issues around that. But coping with anxiety about what it is to be breathless in the midst of this. And I think just with the racism that's going on with the virus, you know, I think feeling breathless is a kind of normative response. So we've been doing 3-4 breathing together, just breathing in through our noses for 3 and out for 4. And breathing out one breath longer because that activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So finding kind of self-soothing techniques that work, whether it's relying on our meditation practices, whether it's finding touchstone prayers that work for us, that bookend the day. And sometimes some of our normal practices are really helpful, and sometimes actually in the midst of this they just don't feel meaningful at all. So finding what works for me, finding what works for you, finding what works in our communities. And I think this is going to be different over the life cycle of this disaster, because what is it when we can meet together but we can't sing together? Those kind of common things we do in worship, what's this going to look like? And how are we going to find adaptive ways to have a sense of agency, keep a sense of the sacred or the meaningful in the midst of it, and reform ways of being community together and apart in the midst of this?
All right, Will.
Great. So thank you. So tagging on to what Storm has already said, I would say that Harvard put out about a couple of months ago, caring for yourself or caring for others. They borrowed it from Northeastern, but it did cite their sources. So we give them credit. And if I can just black and eye, so they had 11 points, and Storm really pretty much covered their 11 points in her what she was saying. So my black and eyes version of it is, I grew up with Southern parents. Mom was from South Carolina. Dad was from Georgia. They would always say, mind your manners. Mind your manners. And I see some folks shaking their head up and down so they know what I'm talking about. And so for us, mind your manners meant several things. The M stood for mindset, the mindset that you go into any kind of situation. We always often laugh at people that went through Morehouse University. Morehouse makes men. But it was a mindset that there's no problem, there's no challenge that smart people can't figure out. So there's a mindset going into it. The arts, that during this time of that, how you dance, to sing, to write, to draw, to journal, to get into the arts. Nutrition, that it's important. You know, we learned from 9/11, from Katrina, from other disasters, that you know, we don't want to put on 25 pounds at the end of this. And so what we eat, how we take care of ourselves nutritionally is important. There's a ministry of naps, taking naps, that during this time that many of us realize that unapologetically we're taking naps in the middle of the day, and it's okay. We can normalize that. We need it. Our bodies need the rest, and bodies need to be replenished. To exercise, and clearly, you know, always put the disclaimer to all of my students: check with your healthcare provider first to make sure that you can do the kind of exercise that you would like to do, and let them be prescriptive in terms of what kind of exercise, but to engage in exercise. The R stands for respect, that you have to respect other people, and that in the midst of this, that there are going to be a multitude of different perspectives, and it may not mirror your perspective, but we still respect people's right, supposed to be in the land of the free. So people's right, and they may demonstrate in ways that you don't agree with, but that's their right to do. And so we respect other people. And then the S is for support, which we've been talking about all along, is that you can't do this by yourself. You have the support of your community or communities. You have the support of government. You have the support of other entities that help us through this, support of the medical field, et cetera, et cetera. So you mind your manners. That's how we get through it.
Well, thank you for that. And that puts us on our P's and Q's, so to speak. So how do you two, what do you do to relax? I won't ask your favorite guilty pleasure, but what do you do that works for you in order to relax? And sometimes the ability to disconnect interrupts one's ability to relax. And I also mentor or have been helping folk who feel guilty relaxing. So I'll put that part as part of it. But what do you do, Storm, to relax? And I'm going to push because I believe my time is getting few. So I'm not being rude, but I will push.
So I was saying before about agency, blessing, and community. I think relying on the community is one of the things that helps me relax, because if I think it's all to do with me, then it's very hard to be able to step back. And I've seen, Stephen, in our community, one of the ways that I've really appreciated building a community of care, not feeling like you're the only caregiver. And in our faith community, the vestry, the parish council, the board, they all have responsibility for ringing, I think, 6 people each in the community of faith and checking in on them. And if there's anybody that particularly concerns them, then it comes back to the faith community leader. So actually referring, that's a good referral to within a community. And I think in the toolkit, there's a question about what are some of the most useful things. I think there's a section on how to refer to a mental health professional, and the resources in the city, NYC Well, the resources about the National Suicide Hotline and others. And for me, when that's taken care of, I can step back and spend time with my family and do some of those unspoken of things that we're not going to name here.
So you were saying by making a different use of time. I was ready for you to say making fudge brownies or something, but I do get it. I do get it.
My spouse is the baker.
Oh, my gifts of discernment, they just weren't directed in the right place. Dr. Ashley.
I have an unfair advantage. I'm married to a pediatrician and also double boarded in pediatrics and as well as preventative medicine. So I get taken care of very, very well from a physical standpoint. And together we have a 11-pound, three-year-old Shih Tzu. And that helps us to relax because, you know, it's back to real basics. Feed me, walk with me, play with me. What else do you have to do in life? Okay. Yes. So when we get, you know, I start thinking too highly, it's you know, Serafina brings us back to reality. I've also been watching probably more comedy than I have in a long, long time, taking the time to laugh and to laugh very, very, very heartily, unapologetically. Probably some of my members was, pastor was watching what? That's another conversation. But but this being able to laugh and to be grateful in ways that you know, the older I get, I'm in my mid-60s now. So I wake up in the morning, I'm extremely grateful. I don't have minimum amount of pain in my joints. I'm very grateful. The fact that I can still walk and play basketball when I'm allowed to is grateful. So just being able to do those things, and I don't know if I'm going to go to the gym, but definitely I'm going to keep playing basketball and doing those kind of things as my body allows me to do that. So just being in spaces of gratitude and being grateful to people that are around me, that love me, that care about me, and knowing that I have responsibility for other people.
I hear you. Brother Harding wrote in the chat box about time to read. I probably have read more books in the last 3 months in a concentrated time, about 4 or 5, and a manuscript for a friend, and using that time productively and finding out and hearing if we had a nickel or a dime for every time we've heard the term unprecedented, we'd all be rich. But there's a part to it that unprecedented times calls for unprecedented actions. And as we are all being informed, borrowing a page out of Storm's book, our job is to charge the community to give information and not inflammation. In terms of going forward, being able to help people access the tools. It's one thing to be upset, it's a thing to be angry, but we have to be able to translate that into actions that help people to cope. So I'm going to give this back to Peter, but I want to tell a quick story and then give it to you, Peter. I got a phone call from a friend of mine, and after we went through the normal, this was before George Floyd, you know how you go through the pandemic talk of who's in the hospital, who got out the hospital, who died. And we went through that. And then she just asked me, how are you doing, Alfonso? Now, we have many ways to respond to that question and just as many not to answer it. We say things, I'm taking it one day at a time. We say things like, oh, I'm hanging in there. I'm hanging in there. All of those kind of ways of talking, but they don't respond to the question. When she asked me, how are you, Alfonso? I told her, I don't like the street that I'm on. I got to get to Hope Street. And just saying that, I felt a shift in my spirit. Just saying that I got to get to Hope Street. Not only did I say I got to get to Hope Street, I said that's the street that I function best. Our challenge, beloved, is to find that street that we function best on, and to be able to move from that, and to be armed with this toolkit. It is not the last word, but it is an important word. It is an important word as it relates to all of the work, all of the scholarship, and what went into creating this. So I want to thank the writers. I want to thank Peter, my brother and friend. I want to thank Chloe, my sister. I want to thank Dr. Ashley. We love to laugh. Elie Wiesel said that the first casualty of war is humor. You got some humor in your medicine chest. And I'm not saying that everything is funny, but don't just become this walking, talking doldrum. And when you feel and you've heard, pull out the plug, step back, and read the toolkit. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to my brother and friend, Peter. You can wrap it up as you see. Oh, look, they tell you what to do. Thank you, and wrap up. I'll let you do that. How about that?
Thank you. I really want to thank Alfonso, Will, and Storm for sharing their wisdom with us today. If you add it all up together, I'm sure it's quite a few years. But most importantly, it's wisdom carved in experience, and that is something that is in much need today. We get talked at by a lot of voices, but most of those voices haven't walked in our shoes, but these three leaders have as pastors and caregivers. So I really appreciate your time sharing your insights and experience with us. I just do want to mention one housekeeping matter, which is Helena Duran, my colleague, who's waving at us now, will be sending everyone a evaluation. I hope that it's short. I hope that you will take a few minutes to fill it out, because it will help us work with Thrive and the Interfaith Center to make sure that we're producing information and resources and focusing on the trainings in ways that you feel are meeting your needs. I also want to acknowledge my colleague Chloe Breyer, who's on with us now, the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center. Dr. Breyer and I go back also, I don't know, 20 years, right? 20? We don't look that young. We don't look that old, but it's 20 years. You know, we're doing this because experience has shown all of us that clergy can suffer irreparable harm by being caregivers in a crisis setting and not taking care of themselves. And we have all worked with colleagues in ministry who have slipped into substance use and abuse, serious post-traumatic stress challenges, lost their ministries and their family, their meaningful relationships, by not being supported properly by those who were responsible for caring for them, but also by not taking the time, whether it's cuddling your Shih Tzu or eating your husband's cookies, or reading a book or watching the Housewives of New York City. I don't really care what it is, but being intentional about that, but also recognizing some of the signs and symptoms that Storm and Stephen have laid out clearly for us in the toolkit that should indicate to us that we are in distress and that we need help and that there is no shame in needing help. I give this example when I teach disaster chaplaincy courses all the time. Just because you went to medical school doesn't mean you can do brain surgery. Just because you got ordained doesn't mean you're Superman or Superwoman. And ordination in and of itself is about the training, and it is the experience, hopefully, of reaching out to others, checking in how you are appearing and speaking and living out your ministry should be an indication of when things are going wrong. So for those of us that work in the realm of grief, there's a lot of grief today. I think Will touched on it articulately. The shame that we are experiencing as a society for 300 years of abusing the Black community and communities of color that have lived within our borders is a hard day of reckoning. The counter narrative is even more disturbing, the sort of denial narrative, and not me, not my generation, not my fault. It's so tone deaf, it's hard to be patient with it. But the stressors of COVID-19 are profound, and we have no idea when it's going to end. And coupled together, I think they're more than the average person should be expected to tolerate and to navigate well, unless they've got some really great circles of care around them. So I wish you all well as you leave this webinar today, and I hope that you find those circles of care around you, and I hope that you look for answers in how you appear to be coping with the stressors you're under. And I invite you to return to the other webinars that are to come in the weeks to come for Christian leaders, African diaspora leaders, Hindu and Buddhist leaders, Muslim leaders, so that you can find collegiality in the company of other faith leaders seeking wellness for themselves and their congregations. So please look out for that evaluation email, and thank you for your time today.